Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Dalhouse. I'm the Director of the Office of Active Citizenship and Service. And on behalf of that office and the First Amendment Center, as well as the Dean of Students Office, Vanderbilt Student Government, the Vanderbilt Political Review, and the College Republicans, I want to welcome you to tonight's event and to this birthday celebration for the 220th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights. I also want to pay tribute to the folks who did the heavy lifting to make this evening possible. Lily Mason-McKinley, my colleague at Oaks, was indispensable to this. Thank you, Lily. And to our student planning committee, who really just rose to the occasion. We're very excited about this event. And to Emma and Mark and Britt and Kenny and Melissa and Hannah, thank you so much. And Jessica, thank you so much for your hard work in putting this in. This is really something that we're coming together 220 years later to celebrate the ratification of this addition to our Constitution, the 10 Amendments, the Bill of Rights. This document has sparked arguments, debates, everywhere from the chambers of the Supreme Court to the battlefields of the Civil War. In our own time, people who have protested, who have marched, people who've argued with one another, offended each other, all over what the Bill of Rights means and who it includes and who it applies to. Few people in our time, I think, have better lived the spirit and the letter of the Bill of Rights than our speaker tonight, John Seigenthaler. And we're so honored and privileged to have him. John, thank you so much for coming tonight. I've never had a chance to say this publicly, but thank you so much for all you've done for our office and for student life at Vanderbilt and for your contribution. Thank you. I would note also in connection with tonight's celebration that the 20th anniversary of the First Amendment Center is coming up on December the 8th. And this was founded 20 years ago here at Vanderbilt and is a wonderful part of our campus and a great resource. In fact, I was just talking to some folks before dinner, urging them to go see the exhibit there and the many great programs that they offer. It's a great personal privilege for me to introduce my friend and colleague, John Seigenthaler, for tonight's event.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I deeply appreciate the invitation to be here tonight with all of you and the opportunity to talk to you about that moment 220 years ago when the founders of this country dramatically changed direction and decided that rather than the Articles of Confederation, which put the country in an unmanageable plight, at that moment, because of what the founders did, the people of this country decided to create a new direction and to assert individual liberties that had previously been denied. I'd like to go back at the outset, not 220 years, but 224 years, and let's think for a moment about that Constitutional Convention. You know, George Washington was there at the podium. In the back, the old man, Ben Franklin. Madison was there. Hamilton was there. And, you know, they spent a couple of months hammering out ideas about a new sort of government. And over that period of time, they created, as all of you know, 3 separate, sometimes co-equal branches of government: an executive, the president, a Congress, bicameral, a House and a Senate, and a judiciary. And to remove the judiciary just a step from the politics that would dominate the other two branches, they gave them life service on good behavior. And, you know, they had just about completed their work, I guess down to dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And one of their members came in one day, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, but we don't know exactly what he said. There's a record that outlines what he said, but his name was George Mason. He came from Virginia. And he came in, and the effect of what he said was, look, we've been locked up here all these weeks. We've had the doors locked, the shades drawn. We're all sworn to secrecy. Again, I'm paraphrasing. But, but he said, you know, out there's a great suspicion that we are creating a monarchy or something close to a monarchy, gigantic centralized government. And he said, you know, we have 5 states in this country that have bills of rights. What the people are afraid of is that we're taking their individual liberties away. And so George Mason proposed that they take one of those bills of rights from one of the states, grafted on the bottom of this document that had created 3 branches of government, grafted on there and assure the people of the country that their individual liberties would be protected by this Constitution. And his colleagues were tired, worn out from hard work and traveling back and forth from their homes to this convention, and they turned their backs on him. They said no. And they moved forward with the Constitution, and George Mason and 2 of his colleagues walked out. Mason said, before I'd put my hand to a Constitution without a Bill of Rights, I'd cut it off. And he went home to join Patrick Henry and to try to defeat it. And so they came with this Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And 2 years later, that was ratified. But you know, it was not a simple matter to ratify it. Many times we read superficially in our history books and sort of get a sense that things were so bad that people rushed to embrace this new Constitution, but there was great opposition to it. We don't hear much about it, but in the state of Rhode Island, people of the state of Rhode Island and the leaders of the state of Rhode Island said, we're not going there. We're not going to ratify this Constitution of Rhode Island by calling together a state convention. If you want it in this state, the only way you get it is if we have a village-by-village election. Every man and men only voted. Who wants to vote will vote. Again, we don't hear much about it, but they beat that Constitution 10-1 in what was called Rogue Island. North Carolina wouldn't touch it. Yes, they had a convention, but they took no action except to draft, as many of the states were doing, even those that ratified. Many of the states were already passing resolutions demanding either a new convention or that the first Congress give them a Bill of Rights that guaranteed individual liberties. Well, it was ratified. Despite the opposition, North Carolina, Rhode Island. opposition in almost every state, but it was ratified. Most often, the opposition was in the minority because the situation under the Articles of Confederation had been so punishing. And so they ratified it, and then just take one little anecdote. Then James Madison, who had been there, who had turned his back on his fellow Virginian, George Mason, who had written to Paris and told Thomas Jefferson that Colonel Mason, in a twit, in a fit of pique, had walked out. Not the exact truth about what happened, but he said he was upset because we wouldn't go with the Bill of Rights, and Jefferson comes back and said, what this Constitution needs is a Bill of Rights. As far away as Paris, he knew it, and all across this country, he knew it. And because the people, in ratifying it, demanded it 220 years ago, finally, we got this Bill of Rights. So it wasn't easy, and as my friend Mark Dahlhaus has said, it hasn't been easy since. Controversy surrounds those 10 articles, those first 10 amendments to our Constitution. And you know, when you think about our history, it's not hard to understand why it has been so controversial. If you look at our present day politics, it's not hard to understand why it has been quite so controversial. I mean, you know, even as we sit here tonight, there are people all across this country out exercising their First Amendment rights to dissent. You can't always be sure what this group called Occupy really espouses because the signs are so different. As my colleague Gene Policinski pointed out in a column that's going to appear tomorrow, today in St. Paul, Minnesota, a federal judge ruled on the whole issue of Occupy. The government there had banned the presence of the movement from the grounds, had told them no more tents and no more signs. And the judge really sort of divided the baby in half. No tents. No, yes, you can stay there, and you can have signs, and the government can't deny you the right to have those signs. But he said, you know, you really should come together and try to resolve your differences. But the signs will go on, and the tents won't go on. And, you know, he was sort of saying what a local judge here said when Occupy Nashville went to the plaza a few weeks ago, and state police moved in, arrested them, cleared the place out, took them down to be locked up. And the judge said, whoa, wait, no, there is a First Amendment right. And he was right, you know. He dismissed it, and then the governor said, I'm sorry we ever did it. And, you know, there is that First Amendment right, but there is no personal liberty that's absolute. Yes, there's a First Amendment, but obscenity is not protected. Obscene speech is not protected. Libel is not protected. There's a Second Amendment right to bear arms. But in this state and in many states, you must have a permit to carry it, and you may not take a gun on school grounds in many community. So there's no absolute right in this wonderful bill of ours. But the rights are there, and they're broad. And I think back 20 years, as Mark said, to the time I left journalism and came here to Vanderbilt, and with the help and cooperation and encouragement of then Chancellor Joe B. Wyatt, we established the center across the campus and have had a wonderful relationship there. And that protest exhibit is there always, and I invite you anytime to come see it and to experience it and to realize that here in the 21st century, we do enjoy these liberties that go all the way back, 220 years. It hasn't been easy. I look around this room, and I see here interesting phenomenon. I'm 84 years old. My grandson, who's 14, periodically checks on my conduct and asks me, "Where are you going tomorrow, Grand?" And I will tell him. What he says will be the first thing you say to those students you meet at Vanderbilt. "Well, Jack, the first thing I'll say is how happy I am to be with them." "Grand," he says, "you're 84 years old. You're happy to be anywhere." And you know, he's right. I am happy to be anywhere, and I'm particularly happy to be here tonight for this celebration. But think back to just a few years before I was born. Just a few years before I was born, election was coming up. In that election, more than half the people in this room would be denied the right to vote. Denied the right to vote because of your gender. You go back to the middle of the 19th century, when women came together for the first time at Seneca Falls, New York, and began to talk about equal rights for women. It took them more than 70 years to get the right to vote. And in the process of it, they exercised the rights that were guaranteed in this Constitution, and particularly the rights that were guaranteed in the First Amendment. It was unseemly in those days for women to speak out from the public platform. But those women at Seneca Falls and in a series of conventions and conferences that began there and went on across the country, they did speak out. They did protest. They admitted dissent from the opposition, and most often the opposition came from men who were wearing the cloth of religion. Again and again and again, they stood up, those men, recited the words of the Old Testament, the words of Paul, denying the equality of women. And it was a real struggle, a real controversy that set in this country. But they persisted, and they persisted, and they persisted. They lost battle after battle, and finally, in that election year of 1920, finally they prevailed. I'd just like to deal with their ordeal for a moment. There was an organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The women who belonged to that organization were patriots. As World War I approached, They thought about President Wilson in the White House. They thought about the members of his party. They were Democrats in the majority in Congress. And the women in that National American Association said, you know, in a time of danger, a time of threat, we're going to lay off. We're going to withdraw. We're not going to complain. We're not going to push. We're not going to protest. We're going to be patriots. There was a splinter group called the National Women's Party, headed by a woman named Alice Paul. And she said the President of the United States is talking all across this country and even around the world about spreading our freedom. And we don't have the right to vote. We don't have freedom here. And Alice Paul and her small band of followers began to protest, ignored the National Association, picketed the White House, on weekends surrounded the White House, took Wilson's words and put them into banners, paraded them through the streets. Those women were abused. They were knocked down the streets, beaten, kicked, spat upon, their banners torn from their hands, ripped apart. They were thrown into jail. In jail, in protest, they went on hunger strikes. Alice Paul served 7 months in jail. During the hunger strike, the jailers force-fed her by inserting tubes into her nostrils and pumping milk and eggs into her system to keep her alive. Other women joined that hunger strike with her. Released from jail, some of them wearing prison garb, boarded trains, they called them the prison special, and went to other cities to demonstrate what the government had done to deny them their rights. So their protests were covered by a free press. The abuse heaped upon them were exposed. Sympathy was evoked. And finally, in 1920, the government gave women in this country a right to vote. It's hard to believe that for all those years, half the population, and sometimes more, in this country were denied the most basic fundamental right of franchise. They did it by exercising the rights assured in the Constitution. Now let me fast forward to the Civil Rights Movement. Think about that time. We've just lived through the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. I look around this room, and I will tell you, if we were meeting in my youth, it'd be against the law to meet as we meet tonight, an interracial group, a violation of the law. And you know, Nashville plays a vital role in all of that. And Vanderbilt, in a sense, played a vital role in all of that. There was here at Vanderbilt, in the Divinity School, a student about to get his PhD who went into North Nashville and began a series of seminars for students at Fisk, Tennessee State, few from Meharry, large number from American Baptist Seminary. And he conducted a series of meetings and explained to them, Jim Lawson did, Reverend James Lawson, is now a distinguished chair in his name here. But he brought those students together and explained to them the power of nonviolence exercised by relying on rights guaranteed in the Constitution. And he encouraged those students, practiced nonviolence with them in workshops. And then he sent them out across the city on weekends to sit in at department stores. And they were beaten, thrown down, kicked, spat upon, thrown into jail. And a free press covered that, as there is a constitutional right for the press to do. And again, attitudes changed. Their conduct, their exercise of their constitutional right evoked great sentiments of sympathy all across this country, pricked the conscience of the country, and changed our way of life here. And then they went on the freedom rides and helped change a region, and indeed, they helped change our country. And so what happened 220 years ago, when this Bill of Rights was ratified, it happened in a cauldron of controversy. And there have been many moments in the decades that have followed when it has been necessary for groups, women, African Americans, but beyond that, religious minorities. In the early days, it was the Baptists who feared that their rights would be denied them. And a Bill of Rights assured them that government would not punish them for practicing their religion. And then as you look at the evolving decades, each time a minority religion has come into being, this country, so often there have been negative reactions, punitive actions. Just go back for a moment to World War II to talk about one of those moments. We all remember what the Civil Rights Movement was about because we've just celebrated this anniversary. But if I were to tell you that just before the outbreak of World War II, there was a virtual pogrom in this country directed toward Jehovah's Witnesses. It swept this country. Religious houses were burned to the ground. Groups of Jehovah's Witnesses were gathered together, in some places roped together, driven out of town, in one case out of the state. They were beaten. They were denigrated. They were robbed of their rights. And you know, it started in a grade school. Young boy, Billy Gobitis, Jehovah's Witness. Think of this boy, grade school. The teacher says, "We will now stand and salute and recite the pledge to the flag." And Billy says, "Not me. My faith believes in that reading the Bible that has to do with graven images, and this is a graven image, and our religion is against this." And he wouldn't raise his hand. He put his hand in his pocket. His teacher tried to take it out. He was expelled. His sister Lillian was expelled. their father brought a lawsuit. It happened not only to them, but because it made news, it happened again, all across the country. Children of Jehovah's Witnesses were expelled. And then the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know, of course a school system has the right, in order to keep order. I mean, you can't have just every child who's got a different point of view refusing to participate in programs. And besides that, there is a value in rallying around the flag. Again, I'm paraphrasing. And that's what the Supreme Court said, and that's when this pogrom occurred. Jehovah's Witness children all across this country were expelled from schools. States passed laws demanding that people recite and salute the flag. And some went to prison because they refused to tell their children what they needed to do. And you know, all of that made news across this country. And within 3 years, the Supreme Court, I don't know that it's ever happened before or since, went fishing for a case in West Virginia. And the court reversed itself completely and said there are some values in this country, there are some individual liberties that must be lifted above and beyond the reach of the law. And freedom of religion is one of those vital rights. So at every turn, minorities have been forced to exercise the rights that are in this Constitution. You know, I think back on my own life and how I've seen the country change and how I've seen attitudes change. And as we look around us today and look back just a very short time, we know that there are among us members of the Islamic faith. And we know that there have been cases in which they have suffered indignities. We know how difficult it is because only 2 have managed to do it. For a person of the Islamic faith to be elected to public office, 2 members of Congress now, but it was very difficult for both of them. And one suffered outrages when he placed his hand on the Quran and took the oath of office. And the question for all of us, I think, is whether this Bill of Rights that guarantees liberty to everyone really means what it says. I'll close not by quoting from the founders, but quoting Milton's Areopagitica. He said, "Give me the liberty to know, to think, to believe, and utter freely above all other liberties." Those words from Areopagitica we should live with. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression is not the only individual liberty guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. Those amendments, 10 in number, are a vital part of our history. And those of you who are very young should think back on all those controversies over all those decades and do what you can to make sure that the Constitution will be a living Constitution in the decades ahead. Thank you very much for having me. Now, I told Mark, sit down. I told Mark I would, if anybody had a question, I'd be glad. He thought I was going to speak more briefly than I did. So I know that there may be a question. If there is, I'll answer it. If not, I have to go to the bathroom. I'm kidding. But is there anybody who wants to raise a question?
Thank you, Mr. Seigenthaler, for your inspirational words.
Britt, thank you.
So again, we read a lot about Mr. Seigenthaler, but this is really your opportunity to ask a question. So questions. Any questions in the room?
I'll start out. With your background and everything you've been through, what was your feeling about the build-up for the Iraqi war, and that the press, how the press appears to have let us down on really investigating everything that they should have been investigating prior to that fateful day in March?
Well, you know, I think like many people in this country, I believe sincerely that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I mean, I didn't want to go to war there. I don't want to go to war anywhere, not ever again. But I understood what the motive was. The direct answer to the direct question you asked is I know, as one who spent my whole professional life in journalism, that journalism failed. There were no weapons of mass destruction there, and the press didn't ask enough, didn't investigate enough, didn't challenge enough, and the result of it is that we were there and we're still there. You know, that 3 times now I've recited how the press raised our awareness and evoked our sympathies. This is a case where I think the press failed.
We have another question from a member of VTV.
Hello. So I remember exactly where I was when I heard about what had happened on 9/11, and I wanted you to kind of talk about how your life has changed after 9/11 and how you think that that affected the Bill of Rights and how we live out the Bill of Rights.
Ask me again, how I what?
How you think that 9/11 has affected our Bill of Rights and how we live them out every day.
Well, it resulted in the passage of the Patriot Act. And I want to be sure that what I say now is not misinterpreted as being partisan. As most of you know, I'm a member of the Kennedy government in exile, and I worked for the Attorney General as his administrative assistant in the Kennedy administration, and I'm identified most often as a Democrat. And so what I want to say is that President Bush, like most of us, had to be frightened, had to be shaken by the events of 9/11. And I think back on that time, and I remember that each time I got on an airplane or waited in the terminal to board a plane, instinctively I looked at the others who were going to be passengers with a degree of suspicion. And all across the country, people were looking at Muslims in just that way. It changed our way of thinking about people who are our fellow human beings. And And so it's bothersome. And while gradually we have regained a sense of security, I remember the words of Ben Franklin. Patriot Act, you know, every time I go to a library, every time I buy a book in a bookstore, and we now have, thank God, the Vanderbilt bookstore, every time I go into those places, I remember that under the Patriot Act, the librarian or the operator of the bookstore has an obligation to report any person who purchases books that are on a list somewhere. The government has a right under the Patriot Act to look into what we read. And it offends me. It violates, I think, my right to read what I want. It's only one aspect of that act. But let me just say, if Al Gore had been elected president in place of George Bush, I have absolutely no doubt that Congress would have enacted at his urging something close to a Patriot Act. It's true that when we are afraid, our independent liberties are most at risk. Ben Franklin said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And I think that's so true. It's when we're afraid, when our country is at risk, that we must come to understand what those rights mean to us and what it will mean to us if we lose them. That's a long answer, and I'm not sure it's a very good one. I saw somebody raise a hand in the back, and why don't I, rather than keep you all here all night, why don't we take one more question, and then I'll let you go.
Hello, I had a question because I went to the Civil Rights Museum in downtown Nashville, and I saw a film that you were in, I guess, when you were in the Kennedy administration. And it was about, like, James Lawson and activists such as Diane Nash. And I wanted to know how you felt about the movement at that time in Nashville and, like, freedom rides and stuff like that.
I'm sorry. At 84, I have a hearing aid in one ear, and I didn't hear you out of the other ear.
Oh, I apologize. My question.
Don't apologize. I do.
My question was, I said that I saw you in a film about freedom rides and, you know, activists such as James Lawson and Diane Nash in Nashville, and I wanted to know what was your position on the issue of, like, civil rights at the time in Nashville and freedom rides.
Jean's going to help me with your question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize. I take Gene with me wherever I go to translate, and he's always willing to do that. Nashville, the Nashville of my youth was as separated by race as any city in South Africa at the height of apartheid. If you were an African American in those days, and through that period in which John Lewis and Diane Nash and others changed the character of this city, but if you came up in that community and you were African American, anywhere you needed to go or wanted to go, you were barred from going by local ordinance, state statute, federal policy, and by 2 centuries of tradition. Hospital, restaurant, hotel. city park, bathroom, water fountain. It's hard for me to look back on that and realize that I came up in that environment. I've told this story before. I can't remember how many times I sat on a city bus, late afternoon, watched African-American women, most of them carrying bundles, perhaps taking laundry home from some white woman's house where this woman worked as a domestic, taking the laundry home to iron it tonight to get it back in the morning. They come on that bus. These are the counterparts of Rosa Parks, struggle to the back of the bus where the signs and the ordinances and the statutes say they must go. And now what I'm going to say about it is you're not going to believe what I say. I will tell you I sat there as a child and young adult and I never saw them. And you said, that can't be true. I mean, you were there, they were there, you had to see them. And you don't understand why it's true if you haven't read Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man. He says it as a black man. They, the white people, saw me, looked through me, over me, around me. They never saw me. My parents said, if a lady needs a seat, stand up and give her a seat. They didn't mean a black lady. And I knew they didn't mean a black lady. And I look back on that time and try to figure out where my head and heart were. Where were the heads and hearts of my parents? Where were the heads and hearts of my teachers? I never once, on a single Sunday, childhood or young adulthood, heard one word from the pulpit about the indecency, the injustice, the indignity that was heaped on a substantial portion of my fellow citizens. And so I look back on that time in wonder. And when I say in wonder, you can wonder why Southern boys my age carry so much guilt around. Those were bad times, and I know it now. And those were all good questions tonight, but I think that was the best one. Thank you all very much for coming. I do want to call your attention to the program under events. There is money to be won, so read it carefully and participate. Thanks again. Good night.
Thank you again to Mr. Seigenthaler for his great words. Now, before we wrap up, I think there's some other words from Mr. Gene Polisinski, our translator.
Yeah, I'm going to, so often when I'm fortunate enough to be with John as translator or whatever, or being at the First Amendment Center with John, an extraordinary man, an extraordinary place. But let me also mention it very briefly, an extraordinary campaign called One for All, which is a unique coalition of almost 2,000 artists, librarians, academics, journalists, lawyers, poets, actors, anyone who has an interest in free expression, librarians, free expression and the Bill of Rights, celebrating the 220th anniversary of the Bill of Rights and likewise the First Amendment. There's a campaign which in the program is called Free to Tweet. And the money part that John so well designated is for students between the ages, I think, of 14 and 22, you have an opportunity to tweet on that day with hashtag free to tweet on Twitter. You can take us and those who read that tweet to a website or a program, or you can just be eloquent in 140 characters. And the top 22, will win a $5,000 scholarship. That's $5,000 for every decade of the Bill of Rights, for the 220 years of the Bill of Rights. So I would encourage you on that day, starting at midnight all the way through to 11:59 p.m. To tweet at hashtag free to tweet and enter for a chance to win a $5,000 scholarship, but more importantly, beyond even the money, to really support this unique and fragile document, the Bill of Rights. So thank you very much.
And yet another thing to cover before we wrap up, thank yous. If we could have the members of our planning committee please stand up. Please stand up. It really was a team effort, and everyone really pulled together, and this was just amazing. So really good job, guys. A few other people that I would like to highlight is Professor Dollhouse, if you could stand up. And Lily. Lily, don't hide. I remember the first time I actually got a chance to see Mr. Seigenthaler speak was at the museum. And I was in high school, sitting in the audience way in the back. Couldn't even see him because I was so short and still am short. And I just remember sitting there and thinking, I would give anything to be at Vanderbilt. I would give anything to hear him speak again. And it's just such an incredible opportunity to hear him speak again and to be here at Vandy. And I want to thank Lily and Professor Dollhouse for allowing me to be here and serving as my mentors. It really has meant a lot. But it's better. It's better the second time. I promise. All right, so with this evening, I'd like to end with a question. I always hated it when my professors did it, but I've got the mic, so I get a chance to do it now. And it's a pretty simple one. After the Thanksgiving break, we all know it's Black Friday. And everyone gets so excited. There's incredible energy, and every single day in the holiday season, there's just so much excitement. And that excitement is to give a gift to someone because you believe in them. And tonight my question for you all is, what gift would you give our nation? What's the one thing our nation is in need of? I think with this evening and this event, it's a reminder that the thing that our nation is most in need of is active citizenship and service and engagement. I want to thank you guys so much for engaging at your tables. I know a lot of you guys didn't know each other, but hopefully this was an opportunity to really get to know people and connect. It's a reminder that instead of just turning on the news, being a part of it, no matter what it is. It's making sure that when you see something going on, you just don't think it's invisible and let it pass by. You do something about it. And the last thing is to make sure that whatever you discussed in this room doesn't stay in this room, but it goes back to your campus organizations, it goes back to your labs, as someone was telling me, and it goes back to wherever you are. Make sure that this conversation doesn't just stop here. So again, thank you. I know some people had to leave, but it was great to see everyone stay, at least these people here. Thanks again, guys.